My dad said, "Family comes first." The day after my grandmother died, while we were standing in her kitchen with a half-drunk cup of tea still sitting by the sink, like she might walk back in and ask who had left the hallway light on. That was the first thing he said to me that morning that actually mattered. He did not ask how I was holding up, and he did not say we would get through it. He did not say anything that sounded like grief. He just said, "Family comes first." At the time, I did not understand that he was not saying it like comfort. He was saying it like terms. My grandmother died on a Thursday night just after 11. I was the one who got the call from the hospital because I was still listed as one of her emergency contacts, even though technically my dad should have been first. That should tell you something right away about how the family actually worked compared to how my father liked to describe it. He loved the language of family. He loved saying that we took care of our own, that blood mattered, and that family was all you really had at the end of the day. What he loved a lot less was the labor behind those slogans. That part usually landed on whoever was easiest to guilt, and a lot of the time that person was me. I was 36 when Grandma died. I had a decent job in procurement for a shipping supplier, no kids, no divorce, and no dramatic personal collapse, which in my family basically meant I was considered the stable one. I was the reliable one, the one who could handle things. That always sounds flattering right up until you realize people are already measuring how much of their mess you can absorb before you start making noise. Grandma had been fading for a while by then. It was not the movie version of dying. There was no dramatic final speech and no big bedside revelation. It was just the ugly, slow shrinking of a person who had spent most of her life being sharp, loud, practical, and impossible to bully. Her body went first, then her energy, then her appetite, and then whole pieces of the day started getting blurry around the edges. My father visited her when it photographed well. He showed up for birthdays, holidays, and the occasional weekend when he wanted to be able to say he had been there constantly. I was the one who handled the smaller things. I dealt with prescriptions, grocery runs, the TV remote she kept accusing of betrayal, the old food in the fridge, and those quiet afternoons when she did not want conversation so much as another living person in the room. I do not say that to make myself sound noble. I say it because it matters later. There is always a story people tell after someone dies, and then there is the ledger underneath it. Grandma's house was small, old, and stubborn, which made it a lot like her. It was a one-story brick place in a neighborhood that had aged unevenly, where some houses still looked neat and proud while others looked like they were being held together by fresh paint and denial. The back screen door never shut right unless you lifted it first. The hallway carpet had gone flat years earlier. The kitchen tiles were chipped near the stove, and one drawer always jammed halfway unless you leaned into it like you meant it. The house still smelled like her, even at the end. It smelled like tea, old wood, hand cream, and that faint clean laundry smell that somehow survived no matter what else was happening in the room. The night she died, I drove home from the hospital around 1 in the morning with both hands gripping the wheel too hard and one thought running through my head the whole way. I kept thinking that now the real trouble was going to start. I did not think that because I was heartless. I thought it because I knew my family. Death makes some people softer. It makes other people faster, and my father was the second kind. By 9 the next morning, he was already in Grandma's kitchen acting like sorrow had put him in charge by divine appointment. He had the back door open, coffee in one hand, and a yellow legal pad on the table. Seeing that legal pad there the day after his mother died told me almost everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was. He looked tired enough to pass for grieving if you did not know the difference, and my father had always been good at that. He could wear stress like morality for short periods of time, especially when there were witnesses nearby. My Aunt Denise was there too. She was sitting at the table with red eyes and a tissue in one hand. She was Grandma's daughter, my father's younger sister, and the kind of person who cried honestly but thought politically. Even in grief, part of her brain was always moving furniture around in the room and asking who stood where. When I walked in, nobody hugged me. That detail mattered more than it should have. People like to pretend funerals make everybody briefly human. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they just strip the wallpaper off a family and show you the structure underneath. My father looked up and said, "Good, you're here." He did not say hello, and he did not ask if I was okay. He just said, "Good, you're here." I looked at the legal pad and asked what it was. He took a sip of coffee and said, "We need to start sorting things out." My grandmother had not even been dead for 12 hours. I remember looking past him to the sink and seeing her mug still there with the tea line dried around the inside. That ordinary, stupid little detail hit me harder than the hospital had. The mug was still waiting to be washed. The dish towel was still folded over the oven handle. Her reading glasses were still on the counter beside the phone book she never stopped keeping, even after everyone else had given up on them. And my father was already making lists. I asked him if he could give it one day. He looked at me like I was being naive and said, "This is exactly when things get messy if nobody handles them." That sentence told me where the day was going. Denise did not look up, but she said softly, "He's right that some stuff does need to be handled." That irritated me too, because it was technically true, and in families like mine, technical truth is how the ugliest behavior gets through the front door. Yes, somebody had to call the funeral home. Yes, paperwork existed. Yes, practical life continues after death. But there is a difference between dealing with reality and moving into position, and my father was already moving into position. I sat down at the table because standing there made me feel like a child being called into a principal's office. The legal pad had categories on it. He had written funeral home, bank, house, bills, jewelry, and paperwork. The word jewelry made my stomach turn. That was not because Grandma had some hidden treasure chest. She did not. She had a wedding band, a few old pieces, some sentimental things, a thin gold chain she wore on special occasions, and earrings she kept wrapped in tissue in the back of her dresser drawer. None of it was life-changing. That was not the point. The point was that my father had already created a category for extraction. He noticed where my eyes stopped and said, "I'm just being practical." That sentence is the national anthem of selfish people. I asked whether anyone had even found the will. Denise finally looked up and said, "Mom said there was one." My father said, "Then we need to locate it before people start making assumptions." That was another one of his tricks. He always spoke as if danger floated around in the room in the form of other people's weakness. He never spoke as if the real danger might be his own ambition, his own impatience, or his own need to get a hand on things before the room fully understood what was happening. I said, "Maybe wait until after the funeral before acting like there's going to be a knife fight over lamps." He did not like that. His face changed the way it always did when I said something too close to the truth in front of somebody else. His jaw tightened, but he kept the tone controlled. "No one's fighting," he said. "I'm trying to protect the family." That was the phrase, the costume, and the fake noble armor he always put on when what he really meant was that he wanted to establish authority before anyone challenged it. Then he looked right at me and said, "Family comes first." That was the line. That was the first clean signal. Because in his mouth, it did not mean love, and it did not mean loyalty. It meant alignment. It meant stop asking questions and get information. I wish I could tell you I recognized all of that immediately, but I did not. What I recognized was something smaller and uglier. I recognized the tone he used when he expected obedience to arrive disguised as decency. I had heard it before. I had heard it when Grandpa died, and there was that fight over the truck. I had heard it when Denise needed help with her son, and somehow a few weekends turned into 6 months of unpaid childcare. I had heard it when my father borrowed money from me at 28 during what he called a short-term squeeze that somehow stayed unresolved for almost 2 years. It was always the same structure. First came urgency, then came family, then came moral pressure, and then, if necessary, came shame. I asked where the will was supposed to be. Denise said it was probably in Grandma's bedroom, maybe in the filing cabinet, maybe in the desk. My father stood up immediately, and of course he did. I stood up too. He asked why I was getting up. I told him that if he was going through her papers, then I was going too. That landed badly, but not explosively. It landed in the worst way. He gave me that thin, cold look that always meant he was recalculating whether to push harder now or wait until later when there were fewer witnesses in the room. Then he asked, "You think I'm going to steal from my dead mother?" I almost told him that he was exactly the kind of man who asked that question too fast. What I actually said was, "I think nobody should be alone in that room." Denise stood too, slower this time, with the tissue still in her hand, and said she was coming as well. That annoyed him more than he showed, which honestly made me feel better. The 3 of us went down the hall together. Grandma's bedroom still looked occupied in the most painful possible way. The bed was made halfway. A cardigan hung over the chair. A pair of slippers sat partly tucked under the nightstand. There was a tissue box, a Bible, a lamp, and her little notepad with phone numbers written in blue ink and grocery reminders scrawled in a hand that had gotten shakier over the last year. My father went straight to the filing cabinet. He did not pause. He did not look around. And he did not even pretend to feel the room first. That mattered too. I went to the desk. Denise opened the dresser and started crying again when she found one of Grandma's scarves folded on top of the sweaters. I found the will in a manila folder under a stack of old property tax papers in less than 5 minutes. That visibly irritated my father, even though he hit it fast. Good, he said. At least that saves time. Again, his mother had died the night before, and he was talking about saving time. I opened the folder right there. He said, "We should probably read that with everybody calmer." That was the exact moment I knew he did not want uncertainty. He wanted sequencing. He wanted to decide when the information entered the room and under what emotional conditions. So I opened the will anyway, and that was when the day got worse. The will itself was not dramatic. It was written in the same plain, practical language that sounded exactly like my grandmother. There was no mystery, no sentimental speech from beyond the grave, and no strange clause designed to shock anybody. It was simply a clear set of instructions from someone who had always preferred direct truth over performance. She named me executor. That changed the room immediately. I felt it before either of them said anything. My father's face tightened the second I read the line, and Denise looked up with the kind of unsettled expression people get when they realize something important has shifted without warning. My grandmother had not only assigned me a task, she had chosen me over her own son to handle what came next. I kept reading. Her checking account and personal savings were to be used first for funeral costs and any remaining bills. She had listed a few personal items for specific people as well. Denise was supposed to get the old pearl earrings. My father was supposed to get Grandpa's watch and the tool chest from the garage. I was supposed to get the desk from the den and the cedar box at the foot of her bed. One of my cousins was supposed to get the sewing machine because my grandmother had apparently remembered a conversation from years earlier and decided that it mattered. Then I reached the part my father had really been waiting for. The house was to be sold, and after expenses and outstanding debts were paid, the proceeds were to be divided into 3 equal shares. 1 share would go to Denise, 1 share would go to my father, and 1 share would go to me. I read that paragraph twice because even I had not expected it. My father stepped closer and asked, "What does that say?" I looked up at him and said, "You heard me." His jaw tightened. "Read it again." So I read it again, slower that time. Nobody said anything when I finished. You could hear the ceiling fan ticking in the corner, and Denise was still standing there with one of Grandma's scarves in her hand, like she had forgotten she was holding it. Then my father let out one short, dry laugh and said, "That doesn't make any sense." He was not reacting with grief or surprise. He was reacting like reality had made an error, and he was already preparing to correct it. Denise looked at me, then at the folder, then at him. "Mom must have changed it," she said quietly. My father looked at her like she had said something stupid. "Well, obviously she changed it." Then he turned back to me and asked, "When was this signed?" I checked the date and answered, 8 months ago. That only seemed to make him angrier, even though he was trying to hide it. 8 months was recent enough to matter and old enough that he could not just dismiss it as some confused last-minute document signed in a hospital room. He held out his hand and said, "Give me the will." I kept the folder where it was and told him that the will was staying with me. That shut him up for a moment, which I was honestly glad about. "What do you mean it's staying with you?" he asked. "I mean I'm not handing it over." He narrowed his eyes. "That is not your decision." "Yes, it is," I said. "It actually is." That was the first time he looked at me like I had shifted from sun to obstacle, and once that change happens, it happens fast. Denise stepped in before he could push harder. "Can we please just get through the funeral before we start doing this?" That was probably the smartest thing anyone had said all morning. My father took a slow breath and nodded once like he was being generous. "Fine," he said. But nobody does anything stupid. That was another one of his favorite tricks. He always said, "nobody," whenever he really meant me. We went back into the kitchen after that, but the whole house felt different. The legal pad on the table looked uglier than it had before. The coffee smelled burnt. Even the sunlight through the back window felt wrong, too bright for the mood inside that room. I put the will folder into my bag and kept it under my chair. My father noticed exactly where I put it, which was not surprising because he noticed everything when control was on the line. The rest of the day turned into one long list of miserable decisions. We had to deal with the funeral home, the church, the death certificates, what suit he was going to wear, and whether the obituary should ask for flowers or donations. I handled most of it because once I had been named executor, everybody started unconsciously treating me like the person who was supposed to know what to do next. That would have felt flattering in almost any other situation. In this one, it felt like being drafted. My father still kept trying to slip back into control whenever he saw an opening. He wanted to choose the funeral home because he knew the owner. He wanted to talk to the priest because he thought it would sound better coming from family. He even wanted to shape the obituary a certain way, which told me that even grief had to pass through his public relations filter before he was comfortable with it. Every time he said the word family, I could hear the machinery inside it. Around 3 that afternoon, Denise went home to shower and call her son. My father stepped outside to take a phone call. I stayed in the kitchen alone for a few minutes with both hands resting on the counter, staring at the old mug by the sink. That was the first moment I actually felt the loss without paperwork crowding it. I sat down in Grandma's chair at the table and hated all of us a little. She was gone, and less than a full day later the room had already become strategic. When Denise came back, she found me still sitting there. She poured herself a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and asked, "Did you know?" I looked up at her and said, "Did I know what?" "About the will." I shook my head. "No, I didn't." She nodded slowly. "I didn't know either." Then she said the thing that mattered. "She changed it because of you." I did not answer right away, mostly because hearing it out loud made something in me hurt in a different place. Denise sat down across from me. "You were here," she said. He wasn't. There was no accusation in her voice when she said that. She did not need one. My father had built his own by absence. I said, "It still feels weird." She nodded. It probably felt weird to her too. That sounded true. My grandmother had loved my father, and that was part of what made everything with him so exhausting. People imagine difficult parents and adult children living in some clean state of clarity, but that is rarely how it works. Love hangs around just long enough to make reality slower, blurrier, and more painful. I think she loved him enough to keep hoping he would someday become the version of himself he performed in public. I also think she finally got tired of betting the house on it in the most literal way possible. The funeral was on Monday. The 2 days in between were some of the longest I can remember. My father called me 4 times on Saturday and 3 times on Sunday, and most of the calls were just questions pretending not to be questions. He wanted to know exactly what the lawyer had said about the house. He wanted to know whether I had read the whole will. He wanted to know whether there were any older versions. He wanted to know whether Grandma had ever mentioned changing things to me. That last question told me the most. He wanted to know whether there had been some conversation he had missed, some version of events where I had influenced her, and he had simply been deprived of context. I answered just enough to stay civil. No, I had not known ahead of time. No, she had not discussed it with me. Yes, I had read the whole will. No, I was not sending him a copy before the funeral. That last answer made him go quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're really going to do this now?" That phrase again. He made reality sound like a behavior I was choosing just to make his life harder. "I'm going to bury Grandma first," I said. "You should try that too." He hung up on me, which honestly made the rest of my evening easier. The funeral itself was exactly the kind of event my family knows how to perform well. There were dark clothes, polite nods, casseroles, careful voices, and the same set of borrowed sentences everybody uses when grief has to move through a room without becoming too personal. People said the usual things. They said she was strong. They said she would be missed. They said she always spoke her mind. That last one was true enough to hurt, because if she had been in the room watching any of us that weekend, she would have stripped every fake sentence down to bare wood in under an hour. My father gave a short statement after the service that would have sounded sincere if you did not know him. He talked about devotion, resilience, sacrifice, and how much family mattered to her. Denise cried honestly. I almost did too, but not because of him. At the reception afterward, I caught 3 relatives asking the same kind of careful little questions people always ask when they are trying to sound respectful while fishing for information. They wanted to know who was handling her affairs. They wanted to know whether she had left clear instructions. They wanted to know what was happening with the house. The speed of it made me tired. Death never has enough dignity to satisfy the living. especially not in families like mine. My father cornered me near the coffee urn halfway through and said, "We need to talk tomorrow." I looked at him and asked, "About what?" He stared right back at me. "You know about what?" Yes, I did. The house. The will. The version of the family story that had stopped flattering him. I said, "Tomorrow, then." He nodded like we had just scheduled a meeting between civilized adults instead of a fight between blood relatives standing 10 feet away from a tray of dry cookies and supermarket sandwiches. That night, after everybody left and I finally got home, I took the will back out of my bag and read it again at my own kitchen table. It still said the same thing. There was no hidden clause, no dramatic twist, and no cruel lesson from beyond the grave. It was just the same clean structure. 3 equal shares, and I was still the executor. Then I understood that line from Grandma's kitchen more clearly than I had the first time he said it. When my father said, "Family comes first," he had not meant protect each other. He had meant fall in line before the paper turns you into someone I have to negotiate with. That was when I knew the real fight had not started in Grandma's bedroom. It was waiting for Monday. My father called me at 8:03 the next morning and told me to meet him at Grandma's house at 10. He did not ask whether I was free, and he did not ask whether I had slept. He did not ask whether I wanted coffee first or whether maybe we should wait another day before turning a funeral into a strategy session. He just said, "We need to settle this before people start interfering." That phrasing told me everything I needed to know. By people, he meant anyone who might slow him down. He meant a lawyer, a bank, a realtor, Denise, or me. He meant anybody who believed Grandma's will was a document instead of a suggestion. I got there a few minutes early and found Denise already in the driveway, sitting in her car with both hands on the wheel like she was trying to delay getting out by pretending there was still one more text she needed to answer. When she saw me, she stepped out and said, "Tell me this isn't going to be what I think it is." I looked at the front door and said, "You already know what it is." She closed her eyes for a second and said, "I'm so tired." That was the truest thing anyone had said in 2 days. We went inside together. My father was already in the kitchen with a stack of papers spread across the table. These were not Grandma's papers this time. They were printouts from real estate sites, a yellow legal pad, and what looked like a page from the county tax assessor. He had a cup of coffee beside him and his reading glasses pushed up on his head like a man about to walk 2 tired relatives through a very reasonable business proposal instead of trying to reposition a dead woman's estate before her side of the family had even stopped bringing casseroles. He looked up and said, "Good. Sit down." I stayed standing for a moment and asked, "What is all this?" He tapped the papers and said, "It's me trying to keep us from making a stupid decision." There it was again. That was always the trick with him. He framed his own urgency as wisdom and everybody else's hesitation as danger. Denise sat first, mostly because she looked too wrung out to stand through another round of it. I sat across from my father and noticed right away that he had drawn little boxes and arrows on the legal pad. One box said sell now. Another said keep house. Under that, he had written family option and circled it twice. That made my stomach tighten. He tapped the page and said, "I've been thinking about this all night." I believed him. That was part of the problem. He had not spent the night grieving. He had spent it reworking the board. Then he said, "The house does not need to be sold right away." I looked at him and said, "The will says it does." He waved a hand like I had brought up a technicality instead of the central fact. "The will says a lot of things," he said. "That doesn't mean we act like robots and ignore reality." Denise leaned back in her chair and rubbed at her forehead. "What reality are we talking about?" He turned toward her and softened his tone by about 10%, which was how he always talked to women in the family when he wanted to sound reasonable while building a trap. "The reality," he said, "is that Mom would have wanted us to handle this as a family." There was that phrase again, and by then it was doing overtime. I said, "She did handle it as a family. She wrote a will." He ignored me and kept going. "The market isn't great for sellers right now. The house needs work. If we rush into a sale, we're going to lose money. On top of that, we're talking about the family home. Once it's gone, it's gone." That part was slicker than the day before. He had moved on from shock and into narrative. Now it was no longer about contesting the will. It was about protecting value, preserving memory, and preventing regret. It might even have sounded persuasive if I did not know him. Denise asked, "So what are you actually proposing?" He slid the real estate printouts toward us and said, "I keep the house for now." There it was. He was not saying that we should hold it for a while, and he was not saying we should get professional advice and decide carefully. He was saying that he should keep the house. Denise looked down at the papers, then back at him. With what money? That was exactly the right question, and I was glad she asked it first. He did not like it. You could see him suppress the irritation before he answered. I didn't say permanently, he said. I could move in, cover the basic carrying costs, give it some time, let the market settle, and then maybe refinance, maybe buy out the shares, maybe revisit everything in 6 months. I looked at him and asked, with what money are you refinancing anything in 6 months? His eyes went straight to mine. I'm not doing this with you if you're going to take that tone. That almost made me laugh. There was the next trick. Facts became tone the second the numbers turned unfriendly. I'm asking the actual question, I said. And I'm telling you that your grandmother would be sick watching you turn this into a transaction. That landed exactly how he wanted it to. He wanted grief to do what logic would not. I said, it is a transaction, and it is also an estate. Those are not insults. That's what this is. Denise looked between us and said, can we stay on one thing at a time? My father nodded like that was what he had been doing all along. One thing at a time, then, he said, the house should stay in the family. I looked at the legal pad and said, the house is in the family right now. The will still says it gets sold. He leaned back in his chair and said, you're the executor. You have discretion. That line sat there for a second, because now we were finally at the center of it. This meeting was not really about the house. It was about me. It was about whether he could pressure the person holding the paperwork into turning Grandma's clean instructions into one more family swamp, where he could negotiate from emotion and delay. I said, executor doesn't mean I get to ignore the will. His face hardened. It means you're supposed to act in the best interest of the family. No, I said. It means I'm supposed to carry out her instructions. He turned to Denise and said, do you hear this? She did not answer right away. Then she said, I hear the part where Mom wrote it down. That annoyed him, though he tried not to show it. She wrote it down, he said, but she also lived in the real world. She knew things change. I said, 8 months ago wasn't 50 years ago. If she wanted flexibility, she could have written flexibility. That landed badly. He looked back at me and said, you are being extremely rigid for someone who got handed a lot of power here. That sentence told me more than he meant it to. In his mind, I had not been given responsibility. I had been given leverage. And leverage, to him, was something morally suspicious unless he was the one holding it. Denise folded her arms and said, nobody handed him anything. Mom chose him. My father let out a dry breath. Yes, he said. And I'm trying not to say what everybody in the family is going to say when they hear about this. The room got tighter after that. I asked, say what? He looked right at me and said, that she wasn't thinking clearly at the end, and you happened to be around more than anyone else. There it was. He had stopped circling it. He was not making a formal accusation yet, but he was letting just enough poison into the room to see how we reacted. Denise sat up straighter and said, no, you are not doing that. He threw one hand out like he was the reasonable one being attacked. I'm not saying that's what happened. You just said exactly enough to make it sound like it happened, she snapped. He turned back to me. I'm saying perception matters. If we force a sale immediately, and I get pushed out of my own mother's house because my nephew decides to play estate manager, people are going to talk. There it was again. Not reality. Not legality. Not the actual words on the paper. People are going to talk. That was his version of a blade. He preferred reputational threats because they let him sound sad instead of cruel. I asked, pushed out of what? You don't live here. That landed clean. He stared at me and said, no, but it was my mother's house. And it was her will, I said. He leaned forward then, both hands on the table, and said, this is exactly what I meant when I said family comes first. You don't cash out your own father 3 days after he buries his mother. There it was at last, the invoice under the slogan. Family comes first meant I was supposed to absorb the cost, so he did not have to feel the consequence. I said, you keep talking like I wrote the will. No, he replied. I'm talking like you have a choice about how ugly you make this. That sat in the room for a second. Denise looked at him and said, you hear yourself, right? He ignored her. He was fully locked on me now. You can either handle this like family, he said, or you can turn it into some legal circus that tears everybody apart. That was his favorite kind of lie, because it always hid the real structure. He created the pressure and then blamed the pressure on your response to it. I said, those aren't the choices. He said, yes, they are. I answered, no, the real choice is whether I follow her instructions or help you get around them. His face changed. That line hit. Get around them, he repeated. That's what you think this is. I think this is you trying to establish a new plan before any professional gets involved, I said. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Professional, he said. You mean lawyers? Yes, I said. He leaned back again and shook his head like I had disappointed him in some deep moral way. This is what I'm talking about, he said. You let outsiders into family business, and suddenly everybody starts acting like a stranger. That line might have worked on me 10 years earlier. That morning, it just made me tired. I looked at him and said, Grandma hired a lawyer before she died. She invited the outsiders herself. Denise actually snorted at that, which made him angrier than if she had shouted. He looked at her and said, You really want this to go that way too? She answered more quietly than I expected. I want it to go the way Mom wrote it. That should have settled it. It didn't, because my father did not really believe other people's positions existed unless they supported his. He looked back at me and said, You need to think long and hard about what happens next if you insist on forcing this. There it was again. Not a scream, and not a threat you could quote cleanly to a police officer. It was just the family version of one. I asked, What happens next? He held my eyes and said, You become the reason this family fractures. That line would have landed harder if he had not spent most of my life using fracture as a management tool. I said, No, I become the person who didn't ignore her will because you were uncomfortable. He stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. Denise flinched. I didn't. He pointed at me and said, Do not do that righteous act with me. You got named executor, and suddenly you think you're above everybody. I stayed where I was and said, That's not what this is. That's exactly what this is, he shot back. He was loud enough now that the whole performance was finally falling apart, which I honestly preferred. At least then the room stopped pretending it was hearing principle instead of appetite. I said, You want me to stall the process, keep the house tied up, and let you slide into it while promising to figure it out later. He did not deny it. That mattered too. He just said, I want a son who understands what family owes each other. There was the confession, dressed up one more time. He was not talking about what the dead were owed, and he was not talking about what the paper said. He was talking about what family owed each other according to the one person in the room who always seemed to invoice his relatives from the top down. I stood up slowly and took the will folder out of my bag. I did not do that because I was going to hand it over. I did it because I wanted the room to see exactly what was governing this argument. I laid it on the table between us and said, This is what she owed. She already decided. Nobody moved for a second. Then Denise said, very quietly, He's right. That did it. Not because my father respected her. It did it because he hated being outnumbered in a room he thought he had opened as a demonstration. He grabbed his keys off the table and said, Fine. But the way he said it made it clear he did not mean fine at all. He took 2 steps toward the door, then turned back and said, When the relatives start asking why her own son got shoved aside, I hope you're ready to explain it. There it was, the fallback weapon. If he could not win on paper, he would go for reputation. I said, Tell them the truth. He looked at me with open disgust and said, You really think truth wins in families? Then he left. The back door hit hard enough behind him that the old frame rattled. Denise sat there for a second and looked at the door like she was trying to decide whether to cry, laugh, or go home and sleep for 12 hours. Then she said, He's not done. No, I said. He's just switching tactics. I picked up the will and slid it back into my bag. That was the moment I stopped thinking of the next step as family management. It was estate management now, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. Denise was right. He was not done. He was just switching tactics. He started with the relatives. By the end of that same afternoon, I had already gotten 2 calls and 3 texts from people who had suddenly decided they were very concerned about how quickly things were moving after Grandma's funeral. That wording told me immediately whose fingerprints were on it, because nothing had actually moved that quickly. We had buried her on Monday, and by Tuesday the only concrete thing that had happened was my father realizing the will was not going to bend around his feelings. My Aunt Marlene called first. She did not waste much time pretending it was a social call. I heard there's tension over the house, she said. That phrasing was almost impressive. She made it sound like the problem was weather in the room and not my father trying to rewrite a dead woman's instructions before the flower arrangements had even started wilting. I said, "There doesn't need to be tension. There's a will." She sighed in that long, weary way people use when they want to sound wise without actually saying anything useful. "Well, wills are one thing. Family is another." There it was again. The slogan had already spread. I said, "That's a nice sentence right up until one person decides family means everyone else absorbs the cost." She got quiet for a second, then asked, "Are you really going to force a sale?" That wording told me my father was already out there building his version. He did not want people saying I was following the will. He wanted them saying I was forcing a sale. He wanted every neutral action to sound aggressive as soon as I was the one doing it. "I'm not forcing anything," I said. "Grandma already made that decision." Marlene lowered her voice, like she was sliding into the respectable part of the manipulation. "You know your father is hurting." That irritated me because it was both true and useless. He probably was hurting. He was also opportunistic, entitled, and already building pressure inside that grief. Human beings are allowed to be more than one unpleasant thing at once. "I know he's hurting," I said. "I also know he started planning around the house before she had even been gone half a day." She did not have much for that, so the call drifted into vague disappointment and soft warnings about family fractures before ending without either of us pretending it had gone well. The second call came from a cousin I had not spoken to in almost 8 months. That one was even more revealing, because he opened with, "Man, I'm not trying to get involved, but Uncle Ray sounds pretty wrecked." My father always worked best through people who announced they were not getting involved while actively delivering his message. I said, "Then don't get involved." He laughed awkwardly and said, "I'm just saying maybe there's a middle ground." There wasn't. That was the part everybody kept dancing around. A middle ground only exists when both people are conceding something. My father's idea of a middle ground was that I should accept delay, ambiguity, pressure, and future promises so he could remain emotionally comfortable while the estate stayed conveniently unresolved. By Wednesday morning, I knew the next move could not be another conversation in Grandma's kitchen, so I called the lawyer whose name was on the will. Her name was Cynthia Harper, and Grandma had picked well. She sounded like the kind of person who had spent years listening to families become their worst versions of themselves over furniture, accounts, and property, and had stopped being shocked by any of it long ago. Her voice was calm, dry, and almost boring, which was exactly what I wanted. I was already drowning in emotional language. I needed someone who spoke fluent document. She agreed to meet me that afternoon. I took the will, the death certificate paperwork, and every note I had made so far, then drove to her office feeling like I was skipping a level in some game I had never wanted to play. Cynthia's office was on the second floor of an older brick building with a carpeted hallway that smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. Her waiting room had 2 chairs, a side table stacked with estate brochures, and one fake plant that looked like it had survived at least 3 economic downturns. When she brought me in, she did not waste time pretending this was anything other than work. "Tell me what has happened so far," she said. So I did. I told her about finding the will. I told her Grandma had named me executor. I told her the house was supposed to be sold and divided into 3 equal shares. I told her my father had already started talking about keeping the house, delaying the sale, and treating me like I had some moral duty to improvise around the document. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and asked the cleanest question anyone had asked so far. "Do you want to administer the estate properly, or do you want to preserve peace by letting your father shape the timeline?" I actually laughed a little at that. Not because it was funny, because she had said out loud what everyone else had been trying to keep wrapped in ribbons. "I want to administer it properly," I said. She nodded once. "Good. Then stop having substantive conversations with him in private." That landed harder than I expected. "Why?" "Because he is not trying to understand the process," she said. "He is trying to alter your comfort with the process." That was one of the best sentences I had heard all week. She kept going. "As executor, your job is not to make every heir feel soothed. Your job is to carry out the estate according to the will and your legal obligations. That does not mean there is no room for civility. It does mean civility cannot replace process." There it was again. Process. I had started noticing that word had the same effect on people like my father that sunlight has on mold. The moment things leave the soft emotional swamp and enter process, a lot of their power starts drying up. Cynthia asked a few more questions, then explained the basic path. I needed to file the will, open probate, notify the heirs formally, begin inventory, secure the property, prepare for sale, and distribute proceeds according to the estate after expenses and debts were settled. It was clean. It was ordinary. And it was exactly the kind of clean, ordinary sequence my father hated, because there was not enough vague space in it for him to handle things as a family. I asked whether I had any obligation to let him move into the house while the estate was open. Cynthia looked at me over her glasses and said, "Only if you enjoy creating avoidable problems." That answer alone was worth the appointment. Then she added, in a more measured tone, "Once an estate property turns into someone's emotional fallback plan, your administrative job becomes much harder. Temporary occupancy becomes assumed occupancy. Assumed occupancy becomes personal claim. Personal claim becomes conflict. The cleanest path is usually the best path." That was exactly what I needed to hear. When I left her office, I had the strange, exhausting relief that comes from finally letting a professional say the thing you already knew but had been hoping not to hear. The estate was not a family conversation anymore. It was a legal process with relatives standing around it. That distinction mattered. I got home around 6 and found 3 missed calls from my father. Of course I did. I listened to the first voicemail while sitting in my car. His voice was controlled, but the anger was there underneath it. "You need to stop freezing people out and call me back. We can still handle this like adults if you stop escalating." That phrasing almost made me smile. He was the one mobilizing relatives, trying to pressure me, and implying Grandma lacked capacity. But suddenly I was escalating because I had called the lawyer she herself had used. I called him back once I was inside, mostly because I wanted to fight on my ground for a change. He picked up on the second ring. "So now you answer." I put my keys on the counter and said, "What do you need?" That annoyed him immediately. "What do I need?" he repeated. "I need to know why half the family is hearing that you're running to lawyers before we've even had a chance to work this out." I walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter where Grandma had once left that half-drunk mug. "There is nothing to work out," I said. "There is a will and a process." That is the kind of sentence people use when they want to hide behind paper. "No," I said. "That's the kind of sentence people use when they're tired of being managed." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "You really think Grandma wanted strangers deciding what happens to her house?" That line would have landed better if Grandma had not literally hired one of those strangers herself. "Grandma hired the lawyer," I said. "Not me." His tone sharpened. "You know exactly what I mean." "Yes," I said. "I do." "You mean you want this handled in a room where you can pressure people?" That was too direct for him to dodge cleanly, so he changed weapons. "You have no idea what this is doing to Denise." That was interesting, because Denise had been the one telling him to stop. I said, "That's funny." She didn't sound confused when she said Mom wrote the will and she wanted it followed. Silence again. Then he said, lower this time, "You are making me look like some kind of thief." There it was. The reputational wound. Not the loss. Not the estate. Just how he would look. "I'm not making you look like anything," I said. "You're doing a lot of the work yourself." He hissed a little through his teeth. "You got very comfortable talking to me this way." "No," I said. "I got tired of pretending your pressure was wisdom." That line made him lose whatever restraint he had left. "You think you're better than everybody because a dead woman handed you paperwork." There it was. Not a grandson fulfilling instructions. Not an executor doing his job. A dead woman handed you paperwork. He had found his emotional frame, and it was contempt. I said, "She didn't hand me anything. She made a decision." He fired back immediately. "She made a mistake." That sentence sat between us for a second. Because once he said it that cleanly, there was no more pretending this was about market timing, strategy, or preserving the family home. Now it was simply this. His mother had chosen something he disliked, so he was prepared to call it error. I said, "You don't get to appeal her death because it offended you." That shut him up long enough for me to hear him breathe. Then he said, "I hope you understand this changes things." There was the threat again, dressed in family clothing. I answered him with the only thing that still mattered. "No, it reveals things." Then I ended the call. Thursday and Friday were ugly in a quieter way. Relatives kept circling. Denise stayed mostly on my side, but in that tired, bruised way people do when they agree with you and still hate the cost of it. My sister texted me just to ask whether dragging lawyers into everything was really necessary. One cousin sent a message that literally said he knew I was technically right, but that sometimes being technically right destroys families. That line made me stare at my phone for a full 10 seconds. Families are not glass animals that shatter because one person follows paperwork. They usually fracture because somebody powerful got too used to being obeyed and caused the first real boundary destruction. Saturday morning, I drove to Grandma's house with Cynthia's checklist in my bag. I had a list for the inventory, the lock change, the initial valuation process, the mail forwarding for estate correspondence, and securing the remaining documents. My father's truck was already there. Of course it was. I parked, got out, and found him standing by the front porch with one hand on the railing like a man posing beside his own injury. "You changed the locks?" he asked the second I got close enough. "Not yet." His face tightened. "But you're planning to." "Yes." "That's unbelievable." I looked at him and said, "No. What's unbelievable is that you thought you might just slide in here and everybody would call it family." He took a step toward me. "You are humiliating me." That word again. Not inconvenience. Not disagreement. Humiliation. Because to him, the presence of process where he expected deference already felt public, already felt shaming, even when almost no one was watching. I said, "This isn't about humiliating you. It's about securing the property." He laughed once, bitterly. "Listen to yourself." "Property." "Yes," I said. "That's what a house in an estate is." He shook his head. "This is why people hate lawyers." "No," I said. "People hate lawyers when lawyers stop them from freelancing reality." That landed. He looked at me with that same mixture of rage and disbelief he always wore when someone refused to accept his emotional framing. Then he said the quiet part. "She was my mother before she was your estate." That line would have hurt more if he had acted like it before she died. I said, "Then you should have shown up like it while she was alive." He went still. That was the cleanest hit I had landed all week, because it wasn't clever. It was true. Denise arrived 10 minutes later, and the presence of a witness cooled him down just enough to keep the rest of the conversation from turning into a full-body shouting match on the porch. We went inside. The house felt deader that day than it had right after the hospital. That's what happens when shock burns off and logistics start replacing people. The rooms do not feel occupied anymore. They feel held. I started opening drawers, taking photos, listing contents, checking categories, and doing everything Cynthia had told me to do. Denise helped. My father hovered, commented, sighed, and tried to turn every neutral administrative action into a symbolic insult. When I tagged the den desk as mine according to the will, he said, "Unbelievable." When I boxed the cedar chest for later transfer, he muttered, "This is disgusting." When I separated the watch and the garage tools for him, he actually said, "You're enjoying this." That one made me stop. I turned toward him and said, "Do you really think this looks enjoyable from where I'm standing?" For once, he did not answer. Because there was the truth sitting right in front of him. A dead mother's house. A divided family. A grandson doing paperwork with a knot in his chest. Nothing about it was pleasurable except, maybe, the fact that he had not gotten control. We finished the initial inventory around late afternoon. Then the locksmith came. That was the moment the whole rotten phrase finally collapsed. My father watched the man take measurements at the front door and said, "You would really lock your own father out of his mother's house?" I looked at him and answered, "I'm securing an estate property." He shook his head. "No, you're choosing strangers over family." There it was, the final shape of it. Family comes first had always meant one thing and one thing only. Family comes first as long as family means him. I said, "No, I'm choosing her written decision over your rewritten version." He looked at me with open contempt. "You are the reason this family is going to remember this as ugly." I was too tired to laugh. "No," I said. "You just never expected anybody to call your bluff while there was still paper in the room." That ended it. He left before the locksmith finished, and the truck door slammed hard enough to shake the windows. Denise stood beside me in the hall and let out a breath she had probably been holding for 2 straight days. Then she said, "Mom knew exactly what she was doing." I looked around the house, at the hallway carpet, the bent screen door, the kitchen tiles, and all the old places where real life had been happening long before any of us decided grief should also become competition. "Yeah," I said. "I think she finally did." The house sold 6 weeks later. Not instantly and not magically, but it sold cleanly enough, and for enough, that all my father's dramatic speeches about disaster turned out to be what they usually were. They were emotional camouflage for personal disappointment. Expenses were paid. Bills were settled. The proceeds were divided exactly the way the will said they should be. Denise got her share. My father got his share. I got mine. He did not thank me. He did not admit I had been right. He did not apologize for trying to bend the whole thing around himself before his mother had even been buried. What he did do was send me one last message after the distribution cleared. It said, "I hope it was worth it." I stared at that sentence for a while. Then I wrote back. It wasn't about being worth it. It was about not lying about what she chose. He never answered. Honestly, that was probably the cleanest ending available. People like my father always think family comes first, makes them sound noble. What it usually means is that they expect love to arrive without boundaries, grief to arrive without clarity, and loyalty to cost other people more than it ever cost them. My grandmother saw that before she died. That was the real inheritance. It was not the money, and it was not the share of the house. It was the clarity. She knew exactly who would try to turn mourning into leverage. She knew exactly who would confuse proximity with entitlement. And she knew exactly who would actually carry out her wishes when the room got ugly. That was why she named me executor. It was not because I was special. It was because she knew I would still be there when the slogans ran out and only the paperwork was left.